Hi, I'm Peter Reynolds, and welcome to Mother Nature Doesn't Give a Crap with Geoff Sheffrin. And joining me, as always, is our resident professional engineer, environmental activist, and shouter from rooftops, Geoff Sheffrin. Geoff, welcome to the podcast.
Peter, thank you. Shouting from rooftops. I like that thought.
I think more people need to shout from rooftops,
I agree.
Geoff.
100%.
So, last episode, we talked a lot about COP27,
Yes.
And all the things that happened in Egypt. Since then, we've had COP15
Yes.
happening in Montreal.
Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit about what COP15 is?
Well, I have to say I like COP15, and I'm just on my screen pulling something up so I can have a look at what I want to talk about. But COP15, I think, is in many respects, perhaps more valuable. That's probably an exaggeration. COP27 has its value, but with 40,000 people attending and, over 18 days and so on, and 196 countries or whatever it was, it's a bit cumbersome. If I look at the COP15, it's less cumbersome. It only had about 12,000 people in Montreal. And I think it had potentially some better outcomes. It really serves the planet better than COP27, which really serves the energy side of the equation. They're both UN-facilitated programs. But if I just give you the highlight of the COP15, the highlight from it, the outcome is 30-30. And what that means is that by 2030, we need to protect 30% of the Earth's lands, oceans, coastal waters, inland waters, and reduce by $50 billion the annual harmful government subsidies and cut food waste in half. That's what COP15 has as a mandate. So, to me, that's pretty strong.
So why do we even need this mandate, Geoff?
Well, I have to say I'm not impressed with either of the COPs because there's just so many people and so much politics. And it's back to one of the earlier podcasts where I talked about the leadership issues. I think I've got to give United Nations and Guterres absolute credit. They're doing an incredible job of trying to pull together the global picture and the global leadership to make these things happen. And COP15 is, I think, every bit as important as 27, and I like to think it's actually more important because it looks at the planet from a green point of view. And if you go back to the 30-30 concept, countries like Canada are not badly equipped in order to say, we'll find a way of making 30% of our green infrastructure, viable and preserved for 2030. It's more doable. You get to a very small country, they have more challenges. And whilst I love the program because the COP15 came up with 4 goals, quite lengthy, but not overly lengthy, and very clear goals, but 23 tasks attached to those goals. Nothing wrong with the 23 tasks. They're all good. I've been trying to get in touch with one of the United Nations people whose contact information I have through the COP15, because I want to ask the question, I'm not seeing the deliverables, I'm not seeing the timelines, and I'm not seeing the teeth in terms of specific accountabilities. What I'm seeing is the global generic picture, but I'm not seeing the specifics. And to my mind, COP27 is worse at that than COP15 is. COP15 at least has the ability, I think, to pull that together. But I haven't seen that stuff, and I'm always skeptical about what we can do when we've seen how wonderfully adept our world leadership is at blah, blah, blah.
Well, I think teeth is the real key here.
Right.
I mean, it's wonderful to get people together and to make agreements which are historic.
Yes.
I mean, we had with the Paris Accord, we had, a historic agreement to reduce carbon emissions during COP15, and it's the Biodiversity Conference.
Yes.
This idea that we have this historic agreement to preserve the earth by 30-30, as you were saying.
Earth and species.
Well, this is what's interesting is that I think maybe that's something that the general audience doesn't realize when they think about saving species or biodiversity. They think of animals.
Yeah.
And, we're forgetting about plants.
Yeah.
And I was reading
And
where
insects.
they talked about, and insects, exactly. And this idea that, if you want to meet the targets of COP27
Yeah.
of net zero by 2050, you have to preserve the rainforests.
Yes.
You have to preserve that biodiversity.
Yes.
So COP15 is needed to make COP27 happen.
Absolutely.
So it's all
related.
interconnected.
It's all interconnected. And the insects are an important piece of it. I mean, if bees die out, we don't have good ways of pollinating plants for food, right? It's just, we haven't got that far yet. We rely on the bees, and there's all sorts of little creatures which are part of the food chain overall, which are required in order to sustain us, which is where COP15 and the biodiversity piece is so critical.
Here's a couple of facts that I found on the World Wildlife website. Yeah. And they were saying that since the 70s, there's been a 69% decline in the in animal species around the world.
Yeah.
And in places like Latin America and the Caribbean, that jumps to 94%.
Right.
And I think this also speaks to one of the failings that I've heard when it comes to COP15, and I wanted to talk to you about that, was this idea of, providing a fund to help developing nations with this, because I can understand, you have a place like Brazil that has a rainforest, and Europe is coming to them and saying, you can't touch your rainforests. And they're looking at European countries and saying, you cut down all your forests to fund your industrial revolution, and that's something we need a way to move forward economically. Yeah. Is there a possibility to have a fund to help us with that? Yeah. Places like Indonesia and the Congo,
right.
They need these funds, but that people walked away from that. That was not an agreement that came out of it. What are your thoughts on that?
And that's exactly the problem. I mean, when I go back to that opening statement, let me just pull it up again for my benefit. When I go back to that opening statement, and you look at the details, reduced by $500 billion the annual harmful government subsidies. Well, that's all part of what you're talking about. This is all what's being done at the moment in terms of sustaining economies. And I don't see a quick way out of this stuff. So many people, the whole world leadership has got to be on board with the concepts of what we're trying to do in terms of COP15 and COP27. And that's where I see the big struggle. We said in the earlier podcast, technology, we can make it happen. Money, I'll come to that at another time because I've come across some more interesting things there. But the other side of it is the leadership. Technical leadership, we can muster. We've got it all over the world, right? But political leadership, I don't know. I'm not very optimistic. Excuse me.
So the next COP16, I guess, is happening in Turkey in 2024.
Right.
What are your hopes for that as we move forward?
Well, I would love to see, and obviously they'll have their agenda, but I would love to see that they build on the 4 goals, on the 23 tasks, but actually get some deliverables attached to that. Some financial deliverables, some commitments from the wealthy countries, some mechanisms for getting the support to the less wealthy, the developing countries, and a mechanism for monitoring that so corruption doesn't filter the money away, so it doesn't get applied where it needs to be applied. That's what I would love to see happening. I'd like to see that on both COPs, actually.
Absolutely. No, and I think really teeth is what is that sort of...
To me, that's the one word, teeth.
Absolutely. And I have another question for the UN. Why is everything called COP? It's so confusing.
I love it.
How does 15 happen after 27? And it's not related to the date. And it's what I often think that the UN needs like a marketing team to say.
Actually, they have a marketing team, but I don't think this is on their agenda. You're absolutely right. I mean, 27 years ago, they started out with this thing called Conference of the Parties. That's where COP came from. Conference of the Parties. Well, all right. Yeah, that sounds reasonable for the first meeting. But after that, I would have thought they'd have come up with some sort of more catchy directive name.
Absolutely. And to separate, a conference that's dealing with reducing emissions to one that's looking at protecting biodiversity. And they're interconnected, of course, but they're also very different. And I think it gets confused, and there's so much noise out there that people are hearing COP this, COP that. Oh, now wasn't it just in Egypt? How is it in Montreal now?
Right.
I think that finding ways to connect with the public and, get them to care is going to get them to vote for the people. And then we have that political leadership.
But if I look at the counterpoint to that, I don't think you can realistically integrate COP15 with COP27. The two programs are justifiably separate and need to be, because what we're doing to create the problem is really what COP27 is trying to solve for us. And what we're doing to keep the thing under control from a planet perspective is what the COP15 process is trying to do for us. So the two, you integrate the two, and quite frankly, we've already got a zoo. What is the acronym for a double zoo? I don't know, but that's what you'll have.
Absolutely. No, for sure. But you can't have one without the other, and you need both for both to succeed. Yep. And I think that brings us on to our next topic, which is clean energy.
Yeah.
And, looking for ways to, get the world off coal.
Yeah.
Looking for new technology out there that's going to, help move us towards net zero. And I know you have some interesting news about a company that's doing just that.
Yeah, I think you're thinking about. Are you thinking about Lightbridge?
Yes.
Okay. Well, and I must preface what I'm saying because I don't know the detail. I am putting pieces of information together by having done extensive searches on Lightbridge itself, and then what I speculate to be not their process, but what I speculate to be their key resource fuel for this program. And from what I've been able to put together, I think they are working on thorium. Thorium is element number 90 in the periodic table. It is to some extent radioactive, but it can be stimulated into radioactivity by inserting, I believe it's a nucleus, into the material, and it becomes radioactive, but at a much more controllable way than uranium isotopes. And I don't know enough about it, so I'm speaking totally off the top of my head. But it sounds as though it's a big step forward because the rods can be manufactured. They seem to have a greater heat generation capability at lower temperatures. They seem to have much less radiation risk, and they don't have that proliferation risk attached to them either, because as a material, it doesn't refine into the ultra-rich plutonium that you need for nuclear power, for nuclear bombs. So there's many pluses there. I'm sure there are some minuses to it. One of the people I've talked to on the nuclear side gave me a couple of insights into what the non-positives might be, but I don't know enough about it yet. And at some stage on a future podcast, knowing who the president of that company or the CEO of that company is, they're down in the US and they have patented technology. I'm going to see if I can find a way of engaging him in our process here.
That would be great. I mean, I find that whole area fascinating. I mean, I'm not the engineer of our dynamic duo. I'm the noob. And
what?
To do some research on this topic, I found it absolutely fascinating. And, just learning things like, currently nuclear fuel provides 10% of the world's electricity.
Yes.
And as we've talked about earlier, it has virtually zero carbon emissions.
Yeah.
And it provides that 24/7 consistent power that sort of wind and solar can't match.
That's right.
So this technology, it looks like sort of the two key things is that you can produce more power out of existing nuclear reactors.
Yep. I'd like to comment on that, but go on. Yeah.
No. Go right ahead.
Well, there's an article in yesterday's Globe and Mail talking about the Canadian nuclear piece and what's going up at Bruce Power in terms of some risks with the uranium, the fuel rods, etc. And there are some risks attached to it. And there's, they're at the end of their life technically, and a couple of them have extended lives on the nuclear reactors in our 3 key Ontario power stations. And there are issues attached to that. And the article, when I read it, I think it was well researched, but I found it to be a little alarmist and a little one-sided, talking about the risks. And yes, there are risks, but it didn't talk about, so I know a little bit about the inside programs that are going on in terms of refurbishing. And that didn't seem to come up in this article. So I'm a little bit concerned that, we shape public opinion through various things, and often we don't have a full balanced viewpoint that covers the pros and the cons of what the issue is.
Absolutely. I believe that's the nuclear industry calling you right now, Geoff.
Yeah, right.
What's interesting is that you're 100% right that this idea of public perception when it comes to nuclear technology and nuclear generation, as a form of power. Of course, people think of things like Fukushima and 3 Mile Island and all these different disasters. And we have already, I know we've already sort of talked about that, but what can the industry sort of do to sort of put the public's mind at ease, when it comes to thinking of nuclear power as green?
Well, I think they're already doing a lot. And I think it's very difficult to get out of the public's mind the risk attached to the 3 most significant global nuclear incidents, which was Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, and Chernobyl, right? You look at that, people, once you get to that point, people don't look any further, right? Mm-hmm. I've gone into the detail, and I know what the safety risk statistics are that relate nuclear, solar, and wind. And they're very comparable, right? And I array that against oil, gas, and coal, and we're miles apart, right? Those things are vastly more hazardous than the 3 green elements. I would say that none of the 3 greens are carbon-free. They are in operation, but you don't make solar panels without process, and that process emits some carbon. You don't make wind turbines without process, and you're emitting carbon. You build a nuclear reactor, you're putting steel and concrete together. They both emit a lot of carbon before you've got them cured and working. Right? It's the same with a hydroelectric dam. The concrete is the piece that creates the carbon. Once they're all up and running, there's virtually no carbon emissions at all. They're green, totally, all of them. Never mind. Shut up. Sorry, I'm getting excited again.
That's okay. Get on that rooftop, Geoff. Okay, that's what you're here for. So, talking about that, I know this idea of getting the world off coal.
Hi.
In particular places like China, and I know nuclear power seems to be one of those solutions. But I know you had some thoughts on a 2-step process to kind of wean the world off coal.
But let me talk over a second to put it into context, because to be fair to China and a lot of other countries, China is investing heavily in green, in terms of hydro, in terms of solar, in terms of wind, and in terms of nuclear, right? But they're also spending money on coal because they need to keep things going, right? I've been doing some extensive research on coal-fired power plants around the world. And I've been scratching my head on this because I keep coming up with the same numbers, which I find a little unbelievable. There's not much more than about 2,200 coal-fired power plants around the world. Now, given that there are 62,000 power-generating plants around the world, if only 2,000 odd of them, 2,200, are from coal, I'm digging more. I want to find out whether or not that's real. If it's real, the stats I've got to dig further into the 2,200, China, India, and the US have about 75-80% of that. China is the biggest, right? So when I go back to the power stations piece out of the 2,200, I add up China, India, and the US. Over half the coal-fired power stations are in those three countries. So, I'm scratching my head a little bit about it because coal is certainly the problem. But I haven't looked at oil and gas because we also have those as power stations, right? Gas more generally than oil, but they're both running, right? But if we then take that a teeny bit further, and I'm looking at the prospect of coal, this is me just throwing something out to the engineers generally. A coal-fired plant requires a mechanism for generating the heat. Ultimately, a pile of CO2 goes up the stack, but generates the heat. So I can boil the water, generate steam, drive the turbines. Well, that's not a big step removed from changing those to gas, in my opinion. I've not looked at the detail. I have no idea about what it is. But I'm thinking gas is nowhere near as bad as coal in terms of environmentally being a problem. It's a problem, but gas is number 3 on that pollution hierarchy list, right? Oil and coal is above it. So I'm thinking, is it not possible to re-engineer, and you may not get gas to all of the coal stations, but is it not possible to re-engineer coal-fired power plants temporarily, transitionally, into gas? So that eventually when you get nuclear and green and other options working at the capacity you need, you can then disband that particular technology. Meanwhile, you've reduced the carbon footprint that particular power plant creates, and you've reduced it quite significantly. You haven't got rid of it, but you've reduced it significantly. So I have no idea what I'm talking about. I've not looked into it. I'm not the engineer, but one of the things I'm trying to reach is engineers. Somebody out there, you must be working on it. Tell me about it.
I think you're right that there are hopefully people listening out there or watching us, that have those kind of solutions. And we encourage them to reach out to us because we'd love to have you on the podcast. This is about talking about climate activism, but it's also talking about new technology and hopefully inspires some people out there to look for new solutions.
Yep.
So we've covered a lot of ground so far, as we always do.
Right.
I wanted to turn to your work at OSPI and the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that and give us an update.
Okay, well, we've had a few meetings since then. I have met with the sustainability head. So at the moment, I'm the chair of that task force and had been the interim chair, but I've just held my hand up to say, guys, it works for both of us, I think. So if you're interested in having me as the full-time volunteer chair for the Climate Crisis Task Force, I'm doing that. I've had a meeting now with the sustainability chair, and I'm planning another meeting with one of the others. And we're trying to coordinate the chairs to make sure that, from my point of view, as I've been asked by OSPI, is to keep an eye on the climate change pieces that the other committees touch on, right? All of them have some influence, and our climate task force, our climate crisis task force is the key. But I'm trying to make sure that what we do in that task force is complementary to what the others are doing, and then we're not overlapping each other. So that's one of my mandates from OSPI, right? OSPI, I believe, has agreed to carry the podcast that we're doing. So we should have a link with OSPI for that. So I think that'll be helpful because the bottom line is, as we started out at the outset, I'm trying to reach everybody, but my primary focus is I want to get to the engineers. Because as I've said time and again at the early podcast, the engineers, we are the ones that can make the technological difference. So, I'm just trying to find ways of encouraging that to happen. So that's where I am with OSPI. So, it's active and I'm having a lot of fun there, and that's great.
Yeah, any way that we can engage, with the community, with the people that can make these changes, and whether that's engineers or politicians or environmental activists or scientists. I mean, our goal is to continue having those conversations. And often I think you touched on this earlier. These conferences are fantastic and bring people together from all over the world, but there's a lot of politics. and there's a lot of things that people can't say.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping, that through this podcast, we'll be able to start those conversations
Right.
and say the things that people maybe want to say but can't.
Right. Interesting thing, Peter. I'd mentioned earlier that on the next podcast, that we'll touch on at the end, I'm expecting to have this person in from the nuclear industry. And what's interesting is, and he and I talked about it briefly, he was at COP27. And I asked him about some of those things in terms of what were the 600 and odd delegates from the fossil fuel industry doing? So we're going to have a conversation about that in the next podcast.
So I know we're always talking about hope, and we're always talking about inspiring young people, with moving forward in these conferences. But tell us again your thoughts on the importance of the date of 2030, because when it comes to COP27, we've agreed to 45% reduction by 2030, and net zero by 2050.
Yep.
When it comes to COP 15, we're talking about 30% by 2030.
Yep.
So those are a lot of numbers, and often when I hear 30 by 30, it sounds cool and these numbers, but how realistic are those goals, and ultimately what are your thoughts on us moving forward to meeting them?
Maybe I can answer that in just two ways. If I look at 2030, and if I go back to COP20, which was in 2015, that's the famous Paris Accord where we agreed 1.5 degrees C should be our maximum by 2030. Well, we are now just over halfway through that time span between 2015 and 2030, and we're at 1.2. Excuse me, we're 80% up the curve, and we're only 50% through the time. I'm not sure I can extrapolate that to be success at 2030. So it's a concern. But the other part about 2030, and then also the net zero piece, I think 2030 is critical, because if I look at the net zero piece, net zero by 2050, all that means, in my opinion, is that we've locked in the status quo. And by the time we get to 2050 and we pass 2030, the status quo in terms of carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxides in the atmosphere is going to be significantly worse than where we are now. Because net zero, and I'll give you a nice little example of net zero. Here's a Canadian example I came across yesterday, and you may have heard of, there's a consortium in Alberta called Pathways Consortium. They represent the 6 largest processors of fossil fuels in Alberta. They represent over 90% of that industry. They are just on the final stages of getting approval, and may already have, I don't know, of carbon sequestering, right? So from their operations, they're going to be spending $16.5 billion to sequester carbon. Great. But here's my net zero piece. That, to me, is a perfect example of net zero. If they achieve the objective of taking all the carbon that they generate in the current operations and sequester it, right, that in itself is a net zero. But what has it done?
For those, Geoff, who don't know what sequestering it means.
Bury the bloody stuff.
How would... Okay.
Does that keep it simple? Bury the freaking stuff.
That's very simple. It's simple enough that even I understand it, Geoff. That is great.
But so let me continue a little bit further. So they're doing this, which is fine, and they're getting their piece under control in terms of a net zero. 2050 is too late, but it doesn't matter. Let's just get into the other part of it. They're still mining a product, and Canada's economy and Alberta's economy depends on us putting it through a pipeline out to BC and other places in order to get it processed. That processing is still where our carbon problem comes from. So the net zero for their piece is fine, but the net zero from the product that is produced and then processed elsewhere, refined into fuels and burned, etc., the net zero piece isn't there. So that's where I struggle with the net zero concept, because net zero, at the end of it, if by 2050 we're at net zero, then all we've got is a whole pile of pollution in the atmosphere. We won't be at 1.5 degrees by 2050. If I live there, I won't live that long, but I'd be delighted if we're no more than 2 degrees. Because you heard us talk about climbing tipping points in the last meet. We're going to be in a shit show, as far as I can see. So, this net zero it's important because it's easy to get your mind around. It's another great statement to feel good about. But it's only an interim solution, and it is not the end point. It can't be the end point. We're not making enough progress.
Yeah, I mean, it's what you talked about. It's one step. It's one piece of the puzzle, and I think that's what we're learning.
Important, but nonetheless.
No, absolutely, and it's one of these challenges. When you talked originally about this idea of needing, $40 trillion, to solve the climate change, numbers like that seem so unreachable, so impossible, that I do understand when governments and organizations, have to set somewhat realistic goals, even though deep down they might realize those goals aren't strong enough.
Right.
Those measures aren't strong enough
Right.
to solve the problem. But hopefully the idea being is that we might not have solved the problem by 2050, but we'll be better off.
Yes. Yeah.
And so
no doubt.
one just hopes those tipping points you talked about, aren't, the end, but we actually do still give ourselves a little bit more time.
Yes. Yeah.
And Mother Nature just a little bit more,
Yeah.
hopefully has a little more patience with us.
Well, I think if we show enough progress to 2030, Mother Nature likely will, ramp down a little bit because, I think over the next 7 years now, I think we're going to see an awful lot more extreme weather. What have we had in terms of, the whole of North America, had this tremendous blizzard over Christmas, right? Yet, global warming, we're getting above average temperatures right now, right? And we've had a record high in the last week or two. This is global warming. The weather patterns are getting more extreme. The good news is we live in the banana belt of Toronto, and in spite of Buffalo had 2 meters of snow, my daughter had snow up to her waist in her backyard in Gravenhurst. A friend of mine who is about 50 kilometers north, he had more than 7 feet of snow in his backyard. With the wind blowing, my driveway over those days was constantly clear and visible because the wind was blowing the snow off. I got 2 centimeters. This is Mother Nature changing the weather patterns.
No, it is so confusing, and you're looking at the news, and it seems, again, as you were saying, Buffalo, Rochester, it's not that far away.
Right.
And the two, incredible extremes. I think my son, for example, was upset that all the rain and warmth that will impact him skiing, but he also, on the flip side, loved the fact that there was no snow to shovel. So he's torn. But hopefully we can use, these extreme weather events, or lack thereof in some cases, to open up that dialogue. And speaking of dialogue, I wanted to talk a little bit about the people who are connecting with us and reacting on social media, which has been really exciting.
Right.
And we just want to thank you all for your support. And it's really fun. When I look at where we're being listened to, Canada and the US, of course, the United Kingdom, Sweden, Sweden, Norway, Mexico, and we even have someone in Nepal who has someone has decided, hey, you know what? I want to listen to these two guys in Canada. So this is super exciting.
This is, you're not kidding.
Just in terms of sort of the...
I'm glad you're keeping track of this, because I'm not, Pete. I'm just too busy trying to get to grovel in the detail.
Listen, you just keep up the stuff from the rooftops, and I'll focus down here.
I'll get a longer ladder.
Okay. But it's really fun, and on Facebook, for example, we're posting clips as well as TikTok and Instagram. And for example, we had one person, Norton, who says when we talk about Mother Nature doesn't give a crap, and they say she's breaking open a can of whoop ass, and we ain't seen nothing yet. And I thought that was I love that. And people saying that I don't blame her. Ungrateful brats acting like we don't need the earth to live.
Right.
So you've got you can see you've got passion. And of course, we would absolutely, for those listening or watching, we would absolutely love to engage with you on social media. So please, on all your social media channels, Mother Nature doesn't give a crap. And it's very exciting.
And if you feel as excited as we do, if you're out there as a listener, pass it on, forward it, get more people engaged. That's what we need to do.
Absolutely. You can share it, you can like, you can subscribe. Perfect. But you're right. Word of mouth is what is going to get going to get the message out there. So I thought, just for fun, Geoff, talking about getting the word out there, SEO and improving the searchability of the podcast is always sort of critical. How kind of Google works is the more environmental related words you use in a given podcast,
right,
when we do our transcripts, that makes us more searchable.
Okay.
So I thought, as a purely promotional piece, you and I would play a little game where we would name words that have to do with environmental activism and the environmental crisis, and we'll go back and forth.
Okay.
And then when one of us misses, then the game is over. But we've said a few words.
Okay.
So I'll start her off, and I will say greenhouse gas,
CO2.
Net zero.
2030 is close, 2050 too far.
COP15.
Great green.
Greta Thunberg.
Activist, perfect.
Greenwashing.
Help. No. Climate disaster.
The climate emergency.
Fix it.
I think that's a good way to end it.
I don't think I'm counterpointing well enough with succinct words. We should try this at the next podcast, and I should come up with single words to make it more searchable.
I'm happy to do that, to play this game with you, because I think there are too many words out there, that describe the climate crisis, and we need to solve these problems to reduce them. I just wanted to, before we go, of course, I know you always have a message for the people out there.
Yep. Well, first of all, there's plenty of positives, and I think this podcast has focused on a few more positives than the two previous ones did. But my closing message, as it always is, movers make things happen. Everyone else is a spectator. So go be a mover.
Thank you so much, Geoff, for your insights today. And thanks, everyone, for watching. Again, you can find us on YouTube as well as wherever you get your podcasts. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.